The words hit Lillian Aldridge like a fist to the sternum, stopping the air in her lungs and the blood in her veins. "I have stopped at every town between here and the mountains," Silas McCrae said, his voice flat and stripped of any color, any warmth, any of the tenderness she had foolishly believed was growing between them. "And none of them held me." He was standing at the threshold of her mercantile, one boot already on the porch and one still on the floorboards of her store, as if his body itself was divided between staying and going. His trail coat was buttoned. His saddlebag was on his shoulder. His gray eyes, which she had spent 3 weeks convincing herself were the most honest eyes she had ever looked into, were pointed at a fixed spot somewhere beyond her left ear. "None of them," she repeated, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, scraped raw at the edges. "Not even this one." He finally looked at her then, and the guilt in his face was the worst part. Not coldness, not indifference. Guilt. The kind of guilt that told her he knew exactly what he was doing to her, and he was doing it anyway. "Lillian, do not." She held up one hand, and she was proud of how steady it was. She had grown up on this frontier. She had buried her father in this soil. She had run this store alone through 2 brutal winters and a summer drought that had killed half the cattle in Cutter's Creek. She was not a woman who broke in front of people. She had made herself that promise a long time ago, and she intended to keep it now. "Do not say my name like that, like you are sorry. If you were sorry, you would stay." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He shifted the saddlebag higher on his shoulder. And then Silas McCrae, the most infuriating and beautiful man who had ever walked through her door, walked out of it. She stood in the silence of her store for a very long moment. The dust motes turned slowly in the afternoon light coming through the front window. The candy jars on the counter caught the sun and threw little prisms across the wooden floor. Outside, she heard the creak of saddle leather and the soft percussion of hooves on packed dirt, and then she heard nothing at all, because he was gone. She turned around, walked behind her counter, and began organizing a shelf of canned goods that did not need organizing. She lined up peaches and tomatoes and beans with meticulous precision, and she did not cry, and she did not think about gray eyes, and she told herself that she was fine, that she had always known this was coming, that she had been warned. But that was not the beginning of the story. The beginning was 3.5 weeks ago, when October was just starting to bite the Wyoming air, and the town of Cutter's Creek was preparing itself for winter with the particular grim efficiency of a frontier settlement that knew exactly what was at stake if it failed. Cutter's Creek sat at the base of the Laramie Mountains, stubborn and small, like a man who refused to be pushed out of a saloon. It had been founded in 1873 by a group of homesteaders who had run out of money and ambition at roughly the same time, and had decided that the flat, wind-swept valley between the mountains and the plains would have to do. By 1878, when this story truly began, it had grown into a modest but functioning town with a proper main street, a sheriff named Dale Pruitt who was mostly honest, a saloon called the Copper Kettle, a church that leaned slightly to the left, a livery, a blacksmith, a doctor who drank more than he should but was still better than nothing, and Lillian Aldridge's mercantile, which was the beating heart of the whole operation. Lillian had turned 26 that spring. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that Eastern fashion plates suggested women should be, but she had dark chestnut hair that she wore in a practical braid, brown eyes that could be warm or severe, depending on exactly what you had done, and the kind of capable hands that told you everything you needed to know about what her life had cost her. She was the daughter of Thomas Aldridge, who had built the mercantile in 1870 and died of a chest infection in 1875, leaving the store, a modest amount of debt, and approximately no instructions to his only child. She had figured it out. She had paid off the debt, rebuilt the inventory, cultivated relationships with suppliers in Cheyenne and Laramie, and made herself indispensable to every family within a 20-mile radius. She was respected. She was trusted. She was, in the language of the frontier, solid. She was also, though she would never have said it to anyone, profoundly lonely. It was a specific kind of loneliness, not the dramatic anguish of a woman pining at a window, but the quiet, persistent ache of someone who had given so much of herself to survival that she had forgotten to leave room for anything else. The men in Cutter's Creek had mostly coupled off or were widowers looking for a housekeeper rather than a partner. She had turned down 2 proposals in 4 years, not out of pride, but out of the bone-deep certainty that marrying either of those men would have been exchanging one kind of loneliness for a worse kind. She had stopped expecting anything different. That was the honest truth of it. She had made her peace with the shape of her life. And then Silas McCrae rode into Cutter's Creek on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, leading a roan horse that looked as tired as he did, and walked into her store to buy flour and coffee and a new tin of matches, and looked at her across the counter with those unsettling gray eyes, and said, in a voice as dry and flat as the plains he had ridden in from, "What does a man have to do to get a fair price in this town?" She had looked at him for a measured moment and replied, "Pay the one written on the board same as everyone else." He had almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She would think about that almost smile for weeks. Silas McCrae was 32 years old, though he could have passed for older or younger depending on the light and his mood. He was lean in the way that men who spend years outdoors become lean, not thin, but whittled down to what was necessary. He had dark brown hair that was a little too long at the back, a jaw that had not met a razor in several days, and those gray eyes that were simultaneously watchful and distant, as if he was always looking at 2 things at once: what was in front of him, and whatever it was he was carrying behind him. He did not volunteer information about himself. Lillian noticed this immediately because in a town like Cutter's Creek, most men who were new arrived with a rehearsed version of their story ready to perform for anyone who asked. Silas answered direct questions with direct but minimal answers. He had come from the south. He was heading north eventually. He was in no particular hurry and under no particular obligation. He took a room at the boarding house run by Mabel Holt, paid a week in advance without being asked, and began the quiet business of being somewhere for a while without committing to anything. He ate his meals at the boarding house or occasionally at the Copper Kettle. He spent his mornings at the livery tending to his horse, a roan mare he called Patience, with a focused attention that told Lillian more about his character than anything he said. He spent his afternoons doing odd jobs for whoever needed them, splitting firewood or mending fences or helping the blacksmith with heavy work, and he did these things without negotiating his price beforehand, which was unusual, and he accepted whatever he was given, which was even more unusual. He came back to her store on Thursday. "I need a better knife," he said, "one I can sharpen properly." She showed him what she had. He examined each option carefully, testing the weight and the balance, running his thumb along the edge with the focused consideration of someone who genuinely knew the difference. He chose a folding hunter's knife with a bone handle and a good Sheffield blade, and when he paid, he laid the coins on the counter one at a time, deliberately, as if he found something important in the precise action of paying his debts. "You are new to drifting," she said, and immediately was not sure why she had said it. He looked up from the coins. "What makes you say that? Most drifters negotiate everything. They come in looking for an angle. You came in asking for a fair price." "That is the question of a man who is new to not having a home, not one who was born to it." Something moved across his face, not offense, something older and more complicated. "I had a home," he said. She waited because she had learned that if you waited long enough, people told you what they meant to say. "It is not there anymore," he said. She nodded and did not press him. She wrapped the knife in a piece of brown paper and tied it with twine, though it did not need wrapping. It was something she did sometimes, when she wanted a person to feel that what they had purchased mattered. He noticed. She saw him notice. He came back again on Saturday, ostensibly for tobacco, and stayed for nearly an hour, looking at her maps of Wyoming territory and the ranges to the north and west. She knew them well, having spent years helping homesteaders and ranchers and the occasional surveyor understand the country. "The passes through the Laramie Range close fast," she told him, without looking up from the inventory ledger she was working through. "If you are planning to go north before winter, you have maybe 3 more weeks. 4 if you are willing to risk it. Is that your way of saying I should leave?" She had looked up then and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "It is my way of saying that the mountains do not care about your plans," she replied. "Neither do blizzards." He had left the store that afternoon and she had thought, well, that is that. He will be gone within the week, but he was not gone within the week. He was still there on Monday when she opened the store at 7 in the morning. Not inside the store, but sitting on the bench outside her father's old post office box, which was bolted to the wall beside the door, whittling a piece of pine into something she could not yet identify. He looked up when she unlocked the door and nodded as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing, as if he had been there always. "I thought you might need the barrels out front moved before the cold sets in properly," he said. "Winter barrels should be under the overhang." She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "I know where my barrels should be," she said. "I know you do," he said pleasantly. "I am offering to move them for you, not telling you something you do not know." She stepped back into the store and let him move the barrels. This became, in its own peculiar way, a pattern. He would find small tasks that needed doing around the mercantile, present them with a kind of dry practicality that gave her no room to argue with, and do them while she worked. He was not intrusive. He understood instinctively, or perhaps from long practice at reading people in order to survive, when she was busy, and when she was not, when she wanted to talk, and when she needed silence. He brought her a tin cup of coffee from the boarding house one morning when she was up to her elbows in a supply dispute with a Cheyenne merchant who had sent the wrong grade of flour. He set it on her counter without comment, and went back outside to repair a hinge on her door that had been slightly loose for 2 years. She drank the coffee and did not thank him, because she was furious with the flour situation, but she was aware of the coffee as a fact, as a small act of noticing, and it settled something in her chest that she had not realized was unsettled. They began to talk in the long afternoons when the store traffic slowed to a trickle. He told her things in small pieces, like a man who had learned the hard way not to give too much of himself to anyone at once. She learned over the course of several days that he was from Texas originally, a place called Mason County, where his family had ranched for 2 generations. She learned that he had a brother named Cormac, whom he had not seen in 4 years, and did not talk about without a particular set to his jaw that told her the subject was complicated and painful. She learned that he had been a cattle drover for 7 years, working the long drives north from Texas through Kansas and into Wyoming and Montana, and that something had happened 2 years ago that had made him stop doing that and start the quieter, more aimless wandering that had eventually brought him to Cutter's Creek. She did not ask what had happened. She let him offer what he would. He offered it on a Thursday evening, 10 days after he had arrived, when she was closing up the store, and he had stayed to help her sort a new shipment of dry goods that had come in on the afternoon stage. They were working by lamplight, and the window glass was black with October night, and the store was warm from the small cast iron stove she kept burning in the corner, and somewhere out in the town a dog was barking at something it had imagined. "I had a family," he said, without any particular preamble while he was stacking bolts of fabric onto the upper shelf. "A wife. Her name was Clara. We had been married 2 years. Lillian set down the tin she was holding and waited. "She died in the spring of '76, he said. "Fever. It took her in 4 days. Our daughter was 5 months old. She survived." He was quiet for a moment, stacking with the same steady, methodical care he gave to everything. "She is with Clara's parents now, in San Antonio. They wanted her. They said I was—" He stopped. He started again. They said a man on the cattle drives was not fit to raise an infant, and they were not wrong, but it is a different thing to know something is true and to accept that it has been decided for you. Lillian breathed carefully. The lamp threw amber light across the high planes of his face, and she could see, just for a moment, the thing he carried. "What is her name?" she asked. "Ruth." Something shifted in his expression when he said it, something that was not quite a smile and not quite pain, but lived exactly at the point where the two became indistinguishable. "She will be 3 years old in March." "Do you write to her?" "I write to Clara's mother. She writes back and tells me how Ruth is getting on." He brought his eyes down from the shelf and looked at Lillian directly. "I know it is not the same thing. I know what I gave up." "You did not give her up," Lillian said. "That is not the same thing as being made to leave." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was something raw and unguarded, and it made her look away first, which she almost never did. After he left that evening, she sat beside her stove for a long time and had a serious conversation with herself about the difference between understanding a person and being drawn to them, and whether she was confusing the two. She was not sure she was. In the days that followed, something changed between them in the way that things change between two people who have each told the other something true and irreversible. The quality of their silences was different. He looked at her differently. She caught herself, more than once, looking at him in ways she needed to stop. He began coming to supper at her table on Friday evenings. This started because Mabel Holt mentioned to Lillian, in the offhand way that Mabel mentioned things she actually cared very much about, that Silas McCrae never ate enough, and that she thought Lillian's cooking was the best in town, and that it was a shame for a woman with such fine cooking to eat alone every Friday. Lillian saw through this immediately and was quietly irritated. She mentioned it to Silas without particular enthusiasm, more to head off Mabel's campaign than from any real desire to extend the invitation. He accepted with the same calm, practical manner with which he accepted everything, and showed up on Friday at 6 o'clock with a jar of honey from the general store, 2 towns east that someone had traded him for a day's labor. She made a pot roast with the last of the good vegetables from her kitchen garden, and cornbread from the good cast iron pan her father had brought from Missouri, and they ate at the small square table in the kitchen behind the store where she lived. The kitchen was the warmest room in the building, with a proper cooking range that she kept in excellent repair, and shelves of preserved goods that represented 2 summers of careful work, and her father's old clock on the wall that had ticked steadily through every difficulty of the last 3 years. He said the food was good without making a performance of it. She appreciated that. They talked through supper and into the evening, the comfortable overlapping kind of conversation that she had almost forgotten was possible, where one topic led to another without effort, and the thread never broke. He told her about the cattle drives, the vast scale of them, the way the land changed as you moved north, the particular quality of the light in Montana at dusk. She told him about the year her father died, the hard specific details of managing grief and managing a business simultaneously, the suppliers who had tried to take advantage of a young woman on her own, and the ones who had been decent and fair. He listened to the whole story without trying to fix it or minimize it, and she found herself talking more than she usually did, saying things she had not said to anyone. When the clock showed 9, he stood and thanked her for the meal. He put on his coat and picked up his hat, and at the door of the kitchen he turned back and said, "Your father built something good here, and you built something better on top of it. That is not a small thing, Lillian." She stood with the dish towel in her hands and watched him go, and then she stood in her warm kitchen alone and felt the size of the room in a way she had not felt it in years. He was there on Saturday, straightening the display of patent medicines she had been meaning to reorganize. He was there on Sunday, helping her neighbor Mrs. Fowler Hall in her winter squash, while Lillian watched from the window and Mrs. Fowler looked up at Lillian with an expression that contained an entire editorial. He was there on Monday when the wind came down from the mountains cold and serious, and he brought an extra load of firewood from the stack behind the livery and stacked it under her overhang without being asked. She stood on her porch watching him work and said, "You cannot just keep doing things for me." He straightened and looked at her with that dry, almost smile. "I am not doing them for you," he said. "I am doing them because they need doing and I am here." "That is a very fine distinction," she said. "No," he said quietly, "it really is not. The town was watching them." Lillian was aware of this the way you were aware of a specific temperature change in the air. Not dramatically, but certainly. Mabel Holt's expression every time Silas left for Lillian's store had moved through satisfaction and into something that looked almost like concern. Dale Prout, the sheriff, had stopped Silas on the street one morning for what appeared to be a casual conversation, but which Lillian, who could read subtext at 200 yards, recognized as a gentle inquiry into his intentions and his character. Silas had apparently passed muster, because Dale had mentioned afterward to Lillian with studied casualness that McCrae seemed like a decent enough man, which from Dale was practically a written endorsement. But there was also Vernon Cross. Vernon Cross was 44 years old, owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, had been a widower for 6 years, and had been conducting a slow, persistent courtship of Lillian for the past 2 of those years. It was not an aggressive courtship. It was more like a long-term business negotiation, in which Vernon appeared at regular intervals to demonstrate his reliability and his acreage and his capacity to provide a woman with security, and then retreated to let the proposal settle like a bid at auction. Lillian had never said yes, but she had never said no in a way that fully closed the door, because Vernon was a decent man and she knew, in the part of herself she was most honest with, that she had been keeping the door slightly open not out of any real feeling for him, but out of the fear of the alternative, which was to fully accept that she might be alone forever. Vernon had noticed Silas McCrae the moment he rode into town. He had noticed, with the particular acuity of a man who understood property and investment, when another person started spending significant time on territory he considered his. He had come into the store twice in the second week of Silas's stay, purchasing things he did not need with a pleasantness that was slightly too deliberate to be entirely natural, and he had spoken to Lillian with a warmth that was fractionally more demonstrative than usual, and he had looked at Silas with the kind of measuring look that men gave other men when they were assessing a threat. On the second visit, as Vernon was leaving, he turned in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I hope you know, Lillian, that my offer stands. It has always stood. I am not a man who withdraws his word." She had looked at him and said, "I know that, Vernon. You are a reliable man." He had nodded and gone. Silas, who had been mending a piece of harness in the corner of the store for no reason she had been able to determine, had said nothing, but she had felt him listening. "He has been kind to me," she said, "not to Silas specifically, but to the air of the room." "I can see that," Silas said, and went back to the harness. That evening, she had lain awake in her bed and thought about what she was doing with careful and severe honesty. She thought about Vernon Cross and his reliable, steady presence and his 2,000 acres and his house with 4 rooms. She thought about 3 weeks, about the specific limitation of 3 weeks and what it was, and was not enough time to know. She thought about a man's hands sorting dry goods by lamplight and a voice saying, "Ruth, march," 3 years old. She thought about the mountains and the passes and the cold that was coming. She got up before dawn and went out to the well and drew water in the dark and stood in the yard in her coat and breathed the sharp air and decided, with the practical clarity that was her particular inheritance from her father, that she was not going to fall in love with Silas McCrae. She had made better decisions in her life, but she had also made worse ones. The second Friday supper was easier and more dangerous than the first, because they had moved past the stage of cautious courtesy into something more comfortable, and comfort, she had found, was a more effective ambush than attraction. He had brought a proper bottle of rye from the copper kettle, nothing excessive, just enough for 2 glasses each. And the conversation had ranged from the state of Wyoming Territory's politics, which both of them had opinions about, to the proper technique for packing a root cellar for winter, to what books she had read, and what he had managed to get hold of during his years on the trail. He had read more than she expected, passed around paperbacks and borrowed volumes and the occasional newspaper, and he had opinions about what he read that were specific and well considered. She had a copy of The Return of the Native that a customer had traded for store credit the previous spring, and she passed it across the table to him when they were talking about it, and his hands took it from hers and their fingers touched, just briefly, just a graze of warmth, and neither of them commented on it, but the room was different after that. He left at 9 again, and this time at the kitchen door, he turned and looked at her for a moment without speaking, and the look said something she did not have language for and was not sure she wanted to name, and then he said good night and was gone. She stood at her kitchen window and watched the lamplight of the boarding house down the street and felt the specific ache of caring about something you had no business caring about. The crisis came in the 3rd week, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. A man named Rutherford Gale rode into Cutter's Creek on a gray Wednesday morning. He rode a black horse and wore good clothes that were expensive without being ostentatious, and he had the air of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in whatever room he entered. He came directly to Lillian's mercantile, which should have told her something, and introduced himself with a card, which was unusual enough in Cutter's Creek to constitute a small spectacle. He was, he said, a representative of the Wyoming Land and Cattle Consortium, a Cheyenne-based organization that had been acquiring land rights and water access throughout the territory for the past 3 years. He had, he said, become aware that the parcel of land on which Thomas Aldridge had built his mercantile, and the adjacent property, including the storage barn and the kitchen garden, was held on a homestead patent that was now technically subject to a competing federal claim due to a surveying error from 1870. He had, he said, been authorized to offer Lillian fair compensation for the property so that the matter could be resolved without the need for legal proceedings. He set a number on her counter. She looked at the number and then at Rutherford Gale and said, "Get out of my store." He smiled the smile of a man who had been here before. "Miss Aldridge, I understand this is unexpected. I would encourage you to take time to consider the offer. Litigation over land patents in Wyoming Territory is a lengthy and expensive process, and I said get out of my store." Her voice was very steady. "I know what you are doing. I have heard of the consortium and I know how these claims work. You find a technicality in a survey record and you use it as a threat to force a settlement. I will not settle. My father's patent is in order. I have the original documents filed with the county." "You have nothing." Something moved behind Gale's eyes, and it was not pleasant. "I will give you a week to reconsider," he said. "You can give me all the time you want," she replied. "The answer will be the same." He left. She stood behind her counter for a moment, and then she went to the back room and checked the file where she kept her important documents, and she found her father's homestead patent, and she read through it with the same careful attention she gave to every piece of paper that mattered. There was, in fact, a surveying error. It was small, relating to a boundary description on the eastern property line that used a reference point which no longer existed. It probably meant nothing in court, but probably was not certainly, and litigation was expensive, and Lillian had very little reserve cash after the drought year. She sat with this for 20 minutes and then she called herself some unpleasant names for sitting with it and went back to work. Silas heard about Gale's visit within 2 hours because in Cutter's Creek information moved faster than horses. He came into the store that afternoon with a look on his face that was carefully neutral, which she had learned was his version of controlled anger. "I heard about the landman," he said. "It is handled," she said. "Tell me about the patent issue," she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done he said, Do you know anyone at the Territorial Land Office? I know of a land agent in Laramie who has dealt with these consortium claims before. His name is Aldous Frey. He has a reputation for being thorough. How do you know that? Because I make it my business to know things, she said. I have been running this store for 3 years and I was watching my father run it for 5 years before that. I know who does honest work in this territory. He nodded. Can you write to Frey? I already have. Another moment of that unguarded look quickly smoothed over. Of course you have, he said, with something in his tone that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it. Gale came back 2 days later, and this time he had a companion, a large, quiet man named Cobb who stood outside the store and said nothing, and appeared to be there entirely for the purpose of making people uncomfortable. Gale's offer had not changed, but his tone had shifted from smooth persuasion to something with an edge underneath it, barely perceptible but present. The consortium is not a patient organization, he said. And a woman running a business alone in a frontier town might find, if things become complicated, that she has fewer allies than she supposes. Lillian was about to respond when the door of the store opened, and Silas McCrae came in. He had been splitting wood in the yard behind the store, and he still had the axe in his right hand, not in a threatening way, just the way a man carries something he is using, but the effect was nonetheless notable. He looked at Gale with those flat, watchful gray eyes and said, "Is there something I can help you find?" Gale looked at Silas for a moment, assessing. Cobb straightened slightly outside. "I was just leaving," Gale said pleasantly, and did. Silas set the axe by the door and looked at her. "I did not need that," she said, because it was important to say it and she could not afford not to. "No," he agreed. "You did not, but they needed to see it." She looked at him across the counter. The sunlight was coming through the window and it caught the dust in the air between them, and she thought, "We are in trouble, Lillian Aldridge. We are in genuine trouble here." That evening, she sent the letter to Aldous Frey in Laramie via the next morning's stage. In it, she laid out the situation with precision and clarity and included the details of Gale's visits. She asked for an assessment of her legal position and the cost of any action required to defend it. She was confident in the strength of her position, she wrote, but she was not complacent. She gave the letter to the stage driver before dawn, and then came back inside and stood in the store in the gray pre-morning light and thought about how much of her life was held in this building, in these walls, in these shelves her father had built by hand. It was not just a business. It was a specific inheritance. It was her father's belief that she could do something with it, and her own long years of proving that he was right. She was not going to let a man with a card from the Wyoming land and cattle consortium take it from her. The following days were complicated, because fear and resolve produced in Lillian Aldridge not inaction but a kind of heightened, tense efficiency that made her harder to be around and almost impossible to talk to. She worked longer hours. She organized things that did not need organizing. She was crisper with customers than was strictly necessary, and she had no patience for anything that was not practical and directly useful. Silas appeared to understand this, or at least to accept it. He kept his distance, more than he had been keeping it, and when he was in the store he worked without comment and left without ceremony. She noticed the increased distance and told herself it was appropriate and sensible, and also noticed that she missed the previous, less appropriate and less sensible version of things. Sheriff Dale Prout came to see her on the 3rd day after Gale's second visit. He was a careful, thoughtful man, the kind of sheriff who understood that his authority had limits and worked effectively within them. He told her that he had looked into Rutherford Gale and the consortium, and what he had found was not encouraging. The organization was operating legally, or at least in the gray area that the law had not yet caught up with, and there were several properties in the territory where similar pressure had been applied. In 2 of those cases, the owners had settled. In one, a homesteader named Paulson had refused, and the subsequent land dispute had taken 18 months to resolve and had nearly bankrupted him, though Paulson had ultimately prevailed. "I cannot run Gale out of town," Dale said. "He has not broken any laws I can demonstrate. I am not asking you to, Lillian said. I am asking you to keep an eye on his man Cobb, who strikes me as the kind of person who does not always confine himself to legal methods. Dale nodded. Already doing it, he said. She thanked him and he left, and she felt somewhat better, and then immediately felt worse, because feeling better made her think about the fact that the only person she actually wanted to tell about this development was Silas McCrae, and that was a significant problem. She told him anyway. She could not quite help it. He came in that afternoon and she told him briefly, efficiently, the way she told him things now, and he listened and nodded and said, Paulson prevailed. That is the important thing. Paulson had reserves, she said. I do not have the same, she stopped. She never talked about money. I know, he said quietly. Lillian, I know, she looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing something complicated with the dust and the silence. I have some, he said. She shook her head before he had finished the sentence. No. It is not no, she said again firmly. Thank you, no. He nodded, accepting this, and she was relieved and slightly devastated in equal measure. The Friday of the third week came around, and she had the pot roast going and the cornbread in the pan and the lamp trimmed, and she told herself she was not looking forward to it, which was such an obvious lie that she was embarrassed by it even in the privacy of her own kitchen. He came at 6 with a small paper packet of dried apples from the general store, and he had shaved, which she noticed and immediately tried not to notice, and he was wearing a clean shirt that she had not seen before, which told her he had either borrowed it from someone or bought it, and either way he had made an effort, and she could not quite look directly at him when she realized this. They sat down and the food was good and the conversation started easily, and then somewhere around the second hour it shifted. He was telling her about a summer in 1874 when the cattle drive had come through this particular stretch of Wyoming, and he had seen these mountains, these exact mountains, for the first time, and how the sight of them had done something to him that he had never adequately explained to himself. They looked like they were going to be there forever, he said. Not in the way that things that are old look permanent, in the way that something looks when it is meant to be where it is. She was watching his hands around the tin cup and she said, without planning to, Is that why you came here, to see them again? He was quiet for a moment. I did not know I was coming here until I was almost here, he said. I have been doing that for 2 years, not deciding where I am going until I am almost there. It is a strange way to live. It sounds lonely, she said. It is, he said simply. The word sat between them, honest and undefended, and she thought, we are both of us very tired of being alone, and that is the most dangerous thing in the world right now, because that is not the same thing as being right for each other. Silas, she said. I know, he said. No, I need to say it properly. She set down her cup. I need you to understand that I am aware of what is happening here between us, and I am not certain it is a good idea. I know that too, he said. You will leave, she said, because it needed to be said plainly. You said yourself you have been moving for 2 years. I cannot this store, this town, I am not able to leave, and I will not ask you to stay. That is not something I can ask. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were doing the thing where they held too much light and too much dark at the same time. I know that, he said. I have thought about nothing else for 2 weeks. And I do not have a good answer for you. He said it without flinching, which she had to respect. He did not pretend. He did not offer her a comfortable fiction. All I know is that I am still here. I have stopped at every town between here and the mountains, and none of them held me. I do not entirely understand what this town is doing differently. She sat with that for a moment. She heard what it was. She understood that he was not promising her anything except a fact, and the fact was that he was still here, which was, in the algebra of a man who had been moving for 2 years, its own kind of statement. She said, I think you should probably still go home and let me think. He stood without argument, put on his coat, picked up his hat. At the door he stopped and did not turn around and said, I am not trying to make you a promise I cannot keep. I want you to know that. I know that, she said. He left and she sat at her kitchen table for a very long time. In the morning, the letter from Aldous Frey arrived on the early stage, faster than she had expected. Frey was thorough as advertised. He had researched the land patent, cross-referenced the survey records from 1870, and identified the specific error in question. His assessment was that while the error existed, it was a surveying discrepancy rather than a legal defect in the patent itself, and that a consortium challenge on this basis would be unlikely to succeed in court. He recommended that she file a corrected survey with the Territorial Land Office, a process he could facilitate for a fee that was substantial but not impossible, and that this action would effectively close the vulnerability the consortium was exploiting. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down and wrote back to Frey confirming that she wanted to proceed, and asked him what he needed from her. She went through her day with the feeling of a problem beginning to resolve itself, which was a different feeling from a problem being over, but was still considerably better than the feeling of the previous week. Gale came back in the afternoon. His pleasantness had thinned considerably. "I am given to understand," he said, "that you have been in contact with a land agent in Laramie." "You are well informed," she said. "The consortium does not appreciate complications, Miss Aldridge." "The consortium is welcome to not appreciate whatever it likes," she said. "My position has not changed. The patent is valid. I am taking steps to formally document its validity. You have nothing. Please leave my store." He left. This time there was no Cobb outside. Lillian registered this and found it more unsettling than Cobb's presence had been. 2 nights later, she woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. She came out of sleep like she had been thrown, on her feet, and at the window before she was fully conscious, and what she saw was a glow from the direction of the storage barn at the back of her property. She dressed in 30 seconds, grabbed the water bucket by the door, and was running across the yard before any rational thought had processed, because every instinct she had was aimed at the barn and the winter stores inside it. The fire was not large yet. It had started on the east side, near the door, and it had found the dry wooden siding and was climbing it with the particular enthusiasm that fire reserved for old dry wood in October air. She threw the first bucket and screamed for help, because her voice carried and her neighbors were close, and that was the only thing that mattered now. They came. They always came in Cutter's Creek, because that was the compact of a small town in an unforgiving land. You came when someone needed you. Mrs. Fowler from next door with her husband, the Hennessy brothers from 2 streets over, Dale Pruitt himself, still buckling his gun belt as he ran, and Silas McCrae, arriving before most of the others, having come from the boarding house at a dead run, taking the bucket from her hands almost before she knew he was there, and throwing himself into the relay line with the focused efficiency of a man who had fought fires before. They got it out. It took 40 minutes and everyone's water, and the east wall of the barn was badly charred and would need significant repair, but the barn was standing and the stores were intact. When it was over, she stood in the yard in the smoky, cold dark, and she was shaking, which she was furious about, and Silas was standing 2 feet away from her, and she looked at the burned wall of her barn and thought, "Gale." "It was Cobb," Silas said, not a question. "Almost certainly," she said. Dale Pruitt was already looking at the ground around the barn with a lantern, reading the story that a man who knows how to look can read in dirt. He found the marks of boots that were not hers. He found the stub of a lucifer match barely near the base of the east wall. It was not proof, but it was something. Silas turned to her. "You need to write to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne," he said. "Tonight or first thing in the morning. Document the fire, document Gale's visits, document everything. Make it official and make it immediately." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I am saying it because it needs to be said tonight while it is still tonight." She looked at him in the lamplight from the barn lantern, smoke-streaked and steady, and she felt something shift in her chest with a permanence that alarmed her. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "I was already awake," he said, and she knew that was not the whole answer, but she did not press him on it. They sat on the porch of the Mercantile until nearly dawn, she with her writing paper and a lamp, composing the letter to the marshal's office with the precision and clarity that had always been her sharpest tool. He sat with his back against the porch post and watched the street and said nothing for hours, and the quality of his silence was something she was not going to think about too carefully, because she had enough to think about. The letter went out on the morning stage. A federal deputy marshal named Hinson arrived 4 days later, having ridden hard from Cheyenne, because arson was a federal matter when it touched on land fraud, which this appeared to. He was a small, neatly organized man with a mustache and the efficient manner of someone who had dealt with the consortium before and was not especially surprised to be dealing with it again. He interviewed Lillian, interviewed Dale Prout, looked at the burned barn wall, looked at the match stub which Dale had preserved, and spent an afternoon asking quiet questions around town. By the end of that day, Rutherford Gale and his man Cobb had been asked, with federal authority, to come to the sheriff's office. Cobb was the weaker link, which Hinson had apparently assessed correctly. Cobb, faced with arson charges in a territory that took property destruction extremely seriously, was willing to provide a statement about Gale's instructions in exchange for certain considerations regarding his own case. Gale was arrested on federal charges of land fraud and criminal conspiracy and taken to Cheyenne under escort. Cobb would face separate proceedings. Hinson told Lillian that the consortium's claim against her property would be referred to the Territorial Land Office, where, combined with the corrected survey that Aldous Frey was filing on her behalf, it would almost certainly be dismissed. She thanked Deputy Marshal Hinson with genuine feeling and shook his hand like the businesswoman she was, and when he rode out of Cutter's Creek, she went back into her store and sat down behind her counter and breathed, slowly, for the first time in 2 weeks. Vernon Cross came in an hour later. He came in with his hat in his hands, and the kind of expression that a man wore when he had been watching a situation carefully and had come to a decision about it. "I heard about the marshal," he said. "And the fire. I want you to know that if there had been anything I could have done, there was nothing any of us could do until there was evidence," she said, not unkindly. "The marshal did his job." "It is over, Lillian." He turned his hat in his hands, a slow, deliberate motion. "I know I have been patient. I have been patient because I believed you needed time. And I know I have eyes, and I know that things have changed this past month." He paused. If McCrae, if he is what you want, then I want you to know that I will not make anything harder for you. You deserve better than a man who makes things harder." She looked at Vernon Cross and saw, perhaps for the first time clearly, what he actually was, which was a genuinely decent man who had offered her something real in his limited way, and who was choosing right now to be graceful about not receiving what he had hoped for. It cost him something, and he was paying it without making her watch him pay it. "Thank you, Vernon," she said. "Truly." He put on his hat and walked out. She stood alone in her store and understood that she had just made a decision without quite deciding anything, in the way that the most important decisions were often made. She walked to the boarding house. She knocked on the front door, and Mabel Holt answered with an expression of barely contained anticipation that Lillian chose to ignore. "Is McCrae in?" she asked. "In his room," Mabel said, stepping back. She went up the stairs and knocked on the second door on the right. He opened it after a moment, shirt untucked, having clearly been sitting with a book. He looked at her with the careful neutral expression, and behind it she could see that he understood that this was not a casual visit. "Can we talk?" she said. He stepped back and let her in. The room was small and tidy in the specific way that a man who was accustomed to having no permanent space made a temporary space orderly. His saddlebag was in the corner. His good coat was hung on the peg. The book on the bed was her father's copy of The Return of the Native, which she had given him 2 weeks ago, and he had apparently read most of. She turned around and looked at him and said, "I am not going to pretend that I do not have feelings for you. It would be dishonest, and I am not a dishonest person." "No," he said carefully, "you are not. But I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me in return, and I am asking you to be honest even if the honest answer is something I do not want to hear." "All right," he said. Are you going to leave? He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on his small table threw a warm circle of light between them. I do not know, he said. I have been trying to answer that question for 3 weeks, and I do not have a complete answer yet. That is honest, she said. I appreciate that, but I need you to understand that I cannot. I have to protect myself here, Silas. I have worked too hard and been through too much to let myself fully. She stopped and found the right words. I cannot be in the middle of something that has an expiration date I am not aware of. I understand that, he said quietly. Then what do we do? She asked. It was a more direct question than she had intended, and it made her feel exposed, but she held it. He crossed the small room and stood very close to her, and he was careful and deliberate, and he cupped her face in his hands the way you held something you were terrified of dropping, and he said, I am going to write to Clara's parents. I am going to ask them if I can see Ruth in the spring. I am going to stop moving long enough to figure out if I am capable of stopping. And while I do that, I would like to stop here if you will let me. She looked up at him. That is not an answer to my question. No, he agreed. It is the beginning of one. She thought about the beginning of answers and what they required from the people waiting for them. She kissed him. It was the briefest possible meeting of mouths, just the first moment, just the acknowledgement of it, and then she stepped back and they stood in the small lamplit room with something that had been invisible a moment ago now permanently visible between them. The beginning of an answer, she said. Yes, he said. She left. She walked back down the stairs past Mabel Holt, who was dusting a shelf that she had apparently needed to dust at that exact moment. And Lillian said good night without stopping and went back across the street and into her store and her kitchen and her life. And she stood at the window and looked at the light of the boarding house until it went out, and she thought, well, here we are. What followed was the most peculiar and quietly extraordinary 3 weeks of Lillian Aldridge's adult life. It was not a courtship in the conventional sense of the term, because neither of them was a conventional person, and the situation was too complicated for the ordinary rituals. It was more like two people who had been alone for a very long time, moving toward each other slowly enough to see the ground beneath each step. It was the careful, deliberate architecture of something being built by two people who understood the cost of structures that failed. He came to the store every day. He helped, he talked. He brought her coffee in the mornings with a regularity that became something she counted on without intending to. He took her riding one Sunday afternoon, both of them on rented horses from the livery, out into the valley where the autumn grass was golden, and the mountain stood against the sky like something from a painting. And they rode without talking for long stretches and talked in others, easy and comfortable. And somewhere in the middle of it, she understood that this was what people meant when they said they fit with someone, this specific ease, this sense of not having to perform. He received a letter from Clara's parents in San Antonio. He came to her store that afternoon, and she could see from the way he carried himself that it mattered, and she said nothing until he showed it to her. The letter was from Clara's mother, a woman named Josephine, and it was careful and not unkind and contained within its careful language an invitation. Silas was welcome to come in the spring and see Ruth, provided he understood that Ruth's life was in San Antonio and her home was there, and they were not raising a question about custody, only allowing him to maintain a connection with his daughter. She watched him read it again after she read it, and she watched what his face did, which was something complex and private and not for her to catalog, and she said, "That is good news, Silas." "It is," he said. "It is not everything I would choose, but it is better than I have had." "She will know who her father is," Lillian said. "That matters more than you think. I did not have enough time with my father. What I had, I have built everything else on." He looked at her and said, "How are you this wise?" "I am not wise," she said. "I just know what is true." November arrived, and with it the real cold, the kind that meant business, the kind that sealed the mountain passes and shortened the days to a thin strip of gray light between dark and dark. Cutter's Creek drew in on itself the way frontier towns did in winter, tightening its circle, everyone closer to their stoves and their neighbors. the social life of the town condensing into the boarding house common room and the church hall and the corners of Lillian's store. Silas did not leave. He paid Mabel Holt for another month at the boarding house. He helped Lillian lay in the rest of her winter supplies and repair the barn wall that Cobb's fire had damaged. And he did this with the focused, patient competence that she had come to understand was not just a practical trait, but the outward expression of who he was. A man who showed up and stayed, and did what needed doing, not brilliantly or dramatically, but steadily, consistently, with the deep reliability of someone who had decided that this was the measure of a person. He told her one evening in late November when they were sitting by her kitchen stove and the wind outside was making the kind of sound that convinced you the world beyond the walls no longer existed, that he had been thinking about what he wanted. "I want to stop moving," he said. "I have been trying to move away from things, and I understand now that that is not a direction, that is just motion." She looked at the fire through the grate of the stove. "And toward what?" "This," he said simply. "You. If that is something you can accept, given everything I told you about my complications." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the gray eyes that she had by now memorized involuntarily, the particular angle of the light in them when he was serious, the way they changed when something moved him. "Ruth," she said. "Ruth," he confirmed. "She is in San Antonio. She will stay there. I will go in the spring to see her, and I will write, and I will send money when I can. She is mine, and I will not disappear from her life. But my life is here if you will have it." She breathed through the weight of that, the specific weight of choosing something that came with complexity already attached. A man who had loved someone before her, and had a child and a grief that was real and did not erase. She had loved her father, she had buried him. She understood that love did not erase other love. It was not a competition or a replacement. It was just a different thing taking up its own space, alongside rather than instead of. "Yes," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her properly this time, the way he had not yet kissed her, with intention and permanence, his hand at the back of her neck and hers at his jaw, and it was neither desperate nor tentative. It was the particular quality of something that had been earned by the long patience of the approach, and it settled against everything in her with the same feeling as a key turning in a lock that has always been a lock, that has always been waiting for the right key. The winter passed around them. It was not simple. Nothing real is simple, and both of them were complicated enough people to know that simple was not actually what they wanted. They had disagreements. She was stubborn in ways that she acknowledged freely and changed reluctantly. He was closed about certain things, kept parts of himself sealed behind that flat, watchful exterior, and she had to learn the difference between the things he was ready to talk about and the things that required more time, and resist the urge to try to force open what was not yet ready. He was good with her. That was the foundational truth of it, the thing she kept returning to when the smaller difficulties made themselves known. He was good with her in the specific way that mattered, which was that he paid attention. He noticed when she was tired and found ways to make things lighter. He noticed when she was worried and did not push her to talk about it but made himself available. He noticed when she was proud of something and named it, said it directly without fanfare. "You handled that well," or "that was a good decision." A man who names the things you do well is a rarer kind than is often recognized. She was good with him. She made space for the complicated parts, the grief that still moved through him sometimes, the absence of Ruth which was always present, the complicated relationship with his brother Cormac that had never been fully resolved. She did not make him perform cheerfulness he did not feel. She fed him and worked beside him, and on the evenings when he was quiet and distant, she simply existed near him without demanding anything, which was, she had found, the most useful thing one person could offer another. Christmas came and the town gathered at the church hall with its leaning steeple, and they had the kind of communal celebration that small frontier towns produced. Potluck food and fiddle music and children underfoot, and the good noise of people who depended on each other and were glad of it. Silas danced with her, which she had not expected, because he had not mentioned being able to dance, and he turned out to be better at it than she was, which she pointed out, and he accepted with the almost smile that had never stopped doing something to her internal equilibrium. The new year of 1879 arrived in a blizzard that locked Cutter's Creek in for 3 days. The town was intimate in the enforced proximity of it, everyone together and nowhere to be but exactly here. Silas spent those 3 days helping with the necessary winter maintenance, keeping the water moving in the pipes, checking on the elderly residents who needed checking on, doing it all with the quiet, organized competence that was his signature, and Lillian watched him doing it and thought, "This is a man who is good at belonging to a place. He has just been a long time finding one." In February, she proposed to him. She did it in the back room of the store on a Saturday morning, while he was helping her reprice a stock of dry goods. She had been thinking about it for 6 weeks and had decided it was not a thing she was going to wait on. She set down the bottle of marking ink and turned to him and said, "I think you should marry me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I was planning to ask you." "I am asking first," she said. "I can see that." "Well, yes," he said. "Obviously yes. I have been yes since November." She crossed the room and he put his arms around her and held her in the practical way of 2 people who had been careful for a long time and were now done being careful. And it was entirely unheroic and completely right. They were married in March, before the mountain passes opened, which meant the whole town could be at the wedding, and there was no possibility of anyone having somewhere else to be. The ceremony was held in the leaning church with its leaning steeple, performed by the Reverend Aldous Grigg, who was not the most inspiring preacher Lillian had ever encountered, but who meant what he said, and that was sufficient. She wore her good dress, the dark blue wool with the white collar, because she was a practical woman and it was March, and the white organdy dress that Mabel Holt had enthusiastically suggested would have required a coat worn over it for the whole ceremony, which defeated the purpose. Silas wore the good shirt he had bought before that second Friday supper, and his clean trail coat and his best boots, which were not very different from his regular boots, but had been recently polished to within an inch of their leather lives. He looked at her when she came down the aisle on the arm of Dale Prout, who had offered because there was no one else and it was a practical solution, and the way Silas looked at her was the truest version of his gray eyes she had yet seen, stripped of the watchfulness and the distance, just the thing itself. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not. She mostly kept the promise. They repeated the words after Reverend Grigg in clear voices, both of them deliberate about it, because neither of them was a person who said things without meaning them. When it was done, he kissed her briefly and seriously, and the assembled population of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming territory, responded with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested everyone in town had been holding their breath on this matter for the past 5 months. Mabel Holt actually cried, which surprised no one. In April, Silas rode to San Antonio to see Ruth. He was gone for 3 weeks, which was the longest 3 weeks of Lillian's recent life. He wrote her a letter from Laramie on the way south, brief and warm, saying he was well and the horse was well and he was thinking about her. He wrote again from Santa Fe. She wrote back to both addresses and did not know if the letters would reach him, but she wrote them anyway. He came home on a Tuesday afternoon in the first full warmth of Wyoming spring, riding patience up the main street of Cutter's Creek, with a particular set to his shoulders that she read immediately as something complex and not entirely resolved. She came out of the store and stood on the porch, and he tied Patience at the rail and came up the steps, and without saying anything took her face in his hands and kissed her with the pent-up feeling of 3 weeks of distance, and she kissed him back, and they stood on the porch in the April sun while the street of Cutter's Creek went tactfully about its business. "How is she?" Lillian asked. He leaned against the porch post with his eyes looking at the mountains. "She is beautiful," he said. "She has Clara's mouth and my eyes, and she is completely terrifying in the way that 3-year-olds are terrifying, because they have absolutely no idea that the world is dangerous. Lillian felt something warm move through her chest. Did she know who you were? Josephine had shown her a photograph. She knew my name. He paused. She let me carry her for about 10 minutes before she decided she had somewhere more important to be, but she waved at me when I left. Lillian reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail. He turned his palm up and held it. I am going to go back in the fall, he said. I want to see her twice a year if they will allow it. Josephine seems willing. Then we will go in the fall, Lillian said. He turned to look at her. We. Yes, she said. We. I have a store manager I can rely on for 2 weeks. Mrs. Fowler's eldest daughter has been working for me and she is very capable. We will go together and Ruth will meet me and I will bring her the best candy from these jars and we will see what happens. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had finally found a name for, which was gratitude in its truest form, not the transactional kind but the kind that came from being truly seen. All right, he said. Summer came to Cutter's Creek and Lillian's store, with Sila's now genuinely part of its operations, was better than it had been in years. He had a practical intelligence about logistics that complemented her commercial instincts precisely. She understood what people needed and what they would pay and how to manage supplier relationships. He understood physical systems, the movement of goods, the efficiency of storage and display, the maintenance of equipment. Together they extended the store's hours and added a small line of hardware goods that she had always wanted to carry but had not had the bandwidth to manage. The business grew. He also, quietly and without making a production of it, began to write to his brother Cormac. She found out about this in July when a letter arrived from El Paso, and the handwriting on the outside was not one she recognized. She set it on the table without opening it, obviously, and when he saw it that evening, his face did the complicated thing she had come to associate with Cormac. What happened between you and your brother? She asked, because she had earned the right by now to ask the direct question. He sat down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him and waited. He was in love with Clara, Silas said at last, before she chose me. They had an understanding, or he believed they did, and then she chose me instead. He never entirely, he stopped. He was at the wedding. He was civil, but he never entirely forgave me for it, even though it was not my doing, and when Clara died he said things that another stop, that I have not been able to get past, until recently. Lillian looked at the letter. What made you decide to write? You, he said simply. The way you talk about your father, the way you talk about the people you love. I do not want to be a man who lets important things stay broken because he is too proud to pick them up. She crossed the table and kissed his temple, which was something she did now because she liked to and he liked her too, and she said, "Write back to him." He wrote back. The correspondence was careful and slow, the way correspondence between men who have hurt each other tends to be, but it was correspondence, and that was something. In August, Lillian realized she was expecting a child. She had been aware of the possibility for a few weeks before the certainty arrived, and she had sat with it for a few days after the certainty, in the particular way that a woman who is accustomed to thinking things through before speaking thinks things through. She told him on a Sunday evening in the kitchen. She set down the dish she was drying and turned to face him and said, directly, "I am going to have a baby." He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her against him, very carefully, with a gentleness she felt in her bones. When? He asked into her hair. February, I think, she said. Maybe March. He pulled back enough to look at her face. His eyes were doing something she had never seen them do before, which was shine with a specific brightness that he was clearly working to contain with varying success. Are you frightened? He asked. A little, she said honestly. Are you? Terrified, he said, and then that near smile became an actual full smile, something she saw so rarely that when it happened it reorganized the whole architecture of his face. Terrified and very, very glad. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heart under her palm. So am I, she said. The fall trip to San Antonio happened in October as promised, and it was worth it in every way that mattered. Josephine Hargrove, Clara's mother, was a composed and slightly formal woman who nonetheless had a fundamental decency that expressed itself in practical ways. One of which was that, when Lillian came through her door, she greeted her with genuine courtesy, rather than the suspicion Lillian had prepared herself for. Lillian brought the candy and also brought a small woolen blanket she had knit herself, because she was not a natural knitter, but she had spent 6 weeks learning enough to make something simple, and it seemed more personal than purchasing something. Ruth was 3.5 and had very definite opinions about everything, which Silas had not exaggerated. She had his eyes, dark gray and watchful, and a mouth that was set in expressions of great purpose. She allowed Lillian to read her a story on the second day of the visit, which felt like a significant diplomatic achievement. And by the third day, she had decided that Lillian was an acceptable presence, and said so by climbing uninvited into her lap, while Lillian was sitting on the Hargrove porch, settling in with the absolute confidence of a small person who has decided what they want. Lillian looked down at this child with her husband's eyes, this small person who was a whole person already in the particular way that small children were, and felt something expand in her chest that she did not have a word for. Not replacement, not substitute. Its own thing, specific and irreversible. Silas was watching from the doorway. She looked up and found him, and he was smiling that full smile again, real and unguarded. They rode home to Cutter's Creek, with the autumn turning the territory golden around them, and the mountains ahead drawing closer with every mile. And she was roundly pregnant, and riding carefully and enormously content in a way she had not been since before her father died. Not the surface contentment of a managed life, but the deep-down kind that came from having something genuine and true and permanent. They arrived in Cutter's Creek on a Thursday afternoon, and the town received them with the particular warmth of a place that had invested emotionally in its people, and liked to see its investments pay off. Mabel Holt had tea ready, Mrs. Fowler had left a covered dish on their doorstep, and Dale Prout stopped Silas on the street to shake his hand for no stated reason. December passed in the comfortable industry of winter preparation and Christmas, and the particular piece of a house where two people were genuinely happy to be in the same rooms. Silas read to her in the evenings, from whatever they had, the novel she had ordered from a bookseller in Cheyenne, the newspaper from Laramie that arrived 2 days late, once a technical manual on steam engine maintenance that had come in with a supply shipment, and which turned out to be surprisingly readable for reasons neither of them could entirely explain. She was large and uncomfortable by January, but she did not complain about it, because complaining was not in her character, though she was deeply appreciative of the fact that he had put extra blankets on the bed without being asked, and had rearranged the layout of the kitchen so she did not have to bend or reach for things she needed regularly. The baby arrived on the 4th of February, 1880. He was a boy, solid and loud and frowning in the specific way of newborns who have strong opinions about the indignity of their new circumstances. Dr. Wendell, who had not had anything stronger than coffee in 2 weeks in preparation for this event, because Silas had apparently had a quiet conversation with him about professional standards, delivered the baby with competent efficiency, and declared both mother and child healthy. Silas held his son in the first minutes of that child's life with the same care he gave to everything important, his large work-roughened hands cradling something infinitely small and new, and his face did the thing that she would remember for the rest of her life, which was go completely open, every guard down, every careful distance gone, just the thing itself, which was love, complete and uncomplicated. "Thomas," she said. He looked up. "After my father," she said, "if you do not object." "Thomas McCrae," he said, testing it. "Yes," she said. He looked back down at his son. "I do not object," he said, in a voice that had lost most of its usual dry composure. "I think Thomas is exactly right." The town came by in a respectable procession over the following week, bringing gifts and food and goodwill. Mabel Holt brought a knitted set of everything a small person could possibly need. Vernon Cross sent a basket of good things from his ranch, including a wheel of proper cheese, and the note inside was warm and gracious, and contained not a single difficult word, which she thought said something very good about who Vernon Cross fundamentally was. Dale Prout came and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and looked at Thomas with the expression of a man who took his responsibility as the protector of a community very seriously, and was thinking about how that responsibility had just expanded by one. Spring came back around, and with it, the first birthday of Thomas McCrae's life, and Silas was 33 and Lillian was 27, and their store was doing well, and their house was warm, and their son was a persistent crawler with definite opinions. And somewhere in San Antonio, a 4-year-old girl with gray eyes was growing up knowing her father's name, and the sound of his voice in his letters, and the soft blue blanket that had come from Wyoming. The letter from Cormac McCrae arrived in April. It was longer than any of the previous letters, and the handwriting was different, more careful, as if it had been written slowly. Silas read it at the kitchen table while Thomas slept in the next room and Lillian worked on the store accounts nearby. When he set it down, she looked up. "He is coming," Silas said. "He wants to come north and see." He paused. "He says he wants to see what I have made of myself." Those are his words. He says they are meant as a question, not a challenge. Lillian put down her pen. "And do you believe him?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that my brother is not an easy man. I think he was wronged in the way that he saw it, and that he carried it longer than was good for him. And I think he is also genuinely asking. And I think," he stopped and looked at the table, "I think Clara would have wanted us to fix it. She loved us both. It would have cost her." Lillian nodded. "Then write back and tell him when is good." Cormac McCrae arrived in Cutter's Creek in late May, riding a bay horse and looking enough like Silas that 3 people in town assumed they were the same man at different times of day before the distinction was clarified. He was 35, leaner than Silas, with the same gray eyes but a different quality to them, something not yet resolved in them, not hardness exactly but incompleteness. He shook Lillian's hand when he met her in the store and looked at her with the careful assessment of a man who had not yet decided whether to trust the situation. The first 2 days were careful. The brothers talked in the ways that men who have hurt each other talk, in practical topics that carried the weight of unpractical things underneath them. The weather, the cattle prices, the state of the territory. Lillian let them find their own footing and did not insert herself into the geometry of it. On the 3rd evening, she left them together in the kitchen with a bottle of rye and told them she was going to bed, which she was not, and she sat in the next room and listened to the silence from the kitchen go through several different qualities until it became the kind that meant something was being said. She could not make out words. She did not try. What she heard was the rhythm of 2 men working through something serious, the long pauses, the occasional sharp exchange, the subsequent longer pause, and then a different quality of quiet that she recognized as the kind that came after. In the morning, both of them were quieter and lighter simultaneously, the way people were after they had laid down something heavy. Cormac stayed for a week. On his last night, he held Thomas with the cautious wonder of a man who had not expected to be moved by a small person and was. Thomas, who had his father's watchful eyes and Lillian's fundamental directness, regarded his uncle with great seriousness, and then grabbed his finger with both hands, which Cormac clearly found more meaningful than he was willing to say. He left on a Thursday morning, heading west toward California where he had a prospect of work. He shook Silas's hand and then, visibly deciding something, embraced him briefly with the awkward formality of men who did not do that easily. He shook Lillian's hand again and said, "He is better with you. I can see that," which was not a simple thing for him to say, and she knew it. "Come back whenever you like," she said. "There is always room." He nodded and rode out of Cutter's Creek, and they watched him go from the porch of the mercantile. "Thank you," Silas said. "You did that yourself," she said. "I did not have anyone to come home to before," he said. "That changes things." She took his hand on the porch railing, and they stood together while Cutter's Creek moved around them, the morning traffic of a small town going about its reliable and necessary business. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because life did not operate on the principle of removing difficulties after a certain quantity of happiness had been achieved. There were hard seasons, a drought year that strained the store's finances and required careful management, and one genuinely frightening month, when the accounts were closer to empty than Lillian had allowed since her father died. There was an illness that passed through Thomas in his second winter that produced 4 days of real fear before it broke. There was the ongoing, never fully resolved complexity of being Silas McCrae's wife in the specific way that meant you loved a man who was still working out what it meant to stay, even when he genuinely wanted to. But they were also, in every real sense of the word, good at this. They were good at the long project of knowing another person, at the careful work of keeping a marriage honest and maintained, at the particular art of being useful to each other in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with love. He learned to manage the store's accounts because Lillian had other things to give her time to, and because he had a facility for numbers that surprised her. She learned to read the sky the way he read it, to understand what the particular shade of the western clouds meant, and when to have the shutters secured. He started teaching Sunday school at the Leaning Church, which surprised her so much that she asked him directly why, and he said, with the dry practicality that was his signature, "Because there are 12 children in this town who need someone to tell them that the world is bigger than Cutter's Creek without it being terrifying." And she had no response to this except to be quietly, profoundly proud of him. Thomas grew. He was, at 2 years old, a large-spirited and insistently cheerful person who had decided that the world was generally friendly and operated on this assumption, with a confidence that both of his parents found simultaneously delightful and alarming. He had Silas's eyes and Lillian's stubbornness, and a smile that he appeared to have produced on his own initiative, wide and genuine and indiscriminate. Ruth came in the summer of 1881, when Thomas was 18 months old and walking, and already attempting the stairs with ill-advised ambition. She came not to visit this time, but to stay for a whole month, because Josephine Hargrove had written in the spring suggesting that perhaps Ruth was old enough for an extended visit, and because Ruth herself, who was 5½ and had been told that her father had a family in Wyoming, had been asking pointed questions about the baby. She arrived on the stage from Cheyenne, having traveled north with a family friend of the Hargroves who was going as far as Laramie, and was delivered the rest of the way by the stage line in the company of the conductor, who reported that she had been thoroughly charming and had asked approximately 1,000 questions about the mountains. Ruth McCrae was a small, serious, and breathtakingly perceptive person who had her father's gray eyes and her mother Clara's particular quality of stillness, and she arrived in Cutter's Creek looking around with those watchful eyes and taking inventory. She looked at Silas for a long moment when she stepped off the stage and then went to him without hesitation and allowed him to pick her up and said, "You are taller in real life." "So are you," he said. She looked at Lillian with the careful assessment of a child who understood that this mattered. "Your store has candy," Ruth said. "It does," Lillian said. "Josephine said you knit the blanket." "I did." "I still have it," Ruth said, and with that the assessment appeared to conclude in Lillian's favor. The month that followed was one of the best months of Lillian McCrae's life. Ruth and Thomas discovered each other with the fascinated intensity of small people who have suddenly been provided with another small person, and the dynamic between them was immediate and somewhat chaotic and entirely charming. Ruth took her big sister's status extremely seriously and spent much of her time explaining things to Thomas that he was too young to understand, which he received with his usual enthusiastic goodwill. They were, against all probability, immediately devoted to each other. Ruth asked Silas every evening to read to her, which he did, sitting in the good chair by the stove with Ruth on one side, and Thomas increasingly determined to also be on his lap on the other. And Lillian sat across the room and looked at this arrangement and thought about all the long roads that had led here, and the specific miracle that two people could be lost for long enough to find each other and make something true. When Ruth went back to San Antonio at the end of the month, she cried, which she had clearly decided beforehand she was not going to do, and cried anyway, which Silas held her through on the platform beside the stage, very steady and very quiet, letting her feel what she needed to feel without trying to fix it. "I will write," Ruth said, scrubbing her eyes with her sleeve. "I will write back," he said, "and I will come again next summer. Every summer," he said. "I promise." She collected herself with the remarkable composure of a 5-year-old who had decided to be brave, and got on the stage, and waved through the window until the stage was around the bend. Silas stood on the platform for a moment after it was gone, very still, the way he was when something was moving through him that he was not ready to talk about. Lillian stood beside him and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying more eloquently. Then he put his arm around her and they walked back up the main street of Cutter's Creek, where their son was with Mrs. Fowler, who had approximately infinite patience for toddlers, and their store was open, and the mountains stood at the end of the street like something permanent and meant. In December of 1881, Lillian found herself expecting again. She told Silas on a Sunday morning, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her with the expression she now recognized as his version of complete and uncomplicated joy, and said, "Again." "Again," she confirmed. "Good," he said, and then, "I hope it is a girl." "You have a daughter," she said. "I would like another one," he said simply. Lillian thought about this, and thought it was the most Silas McCrae thing he had ever said to her. Practical and direct, and containing within its simplicity an entire architecture of feeling. The second child arrived in July of 1882, in the particular heat of a Wyoming summer, and she was indeed a girl, born with the same determined frown as her brother and the same dark chestnut hair as her mother, and she was named Clara June McCrae, for a woman who deserved to be remembered, and for the month she should have been born but arrived 3 weeks ahead of schedule. They wrote to Josephine Hargrove to tell her. Josephine wrote back a letter that was the warmest she had ever sent, saying that she thought Clara would have been glad, and that she hoped Ruth would be a good older sister to both of the new children, which she had no doubt she would be. Silas read that letter at the kitchen table and set it down carefully. "She was a good woman," he said. "Josephine, we were not always," he stopped. "She could have been harder about all of this. She was not." "No," Lillian agreed. "She was not." "Neither were you," he said. She looked at him across the table, their daughter asleep in the next room and their son with great determination attempting to stack blocks in the corner of the kitchen. The October light was coming through the window, and the stove was putting out its steady warmth, and the clock on the wall that her father had brought from Missouri was ticking in the particular rhythm she had listened to all her life. "Neither were you," she said. "You could have kept moving, easier for a man to keep moving." "I know," he said, "but none of them held me." He looked at the kitchen, the walls of it, the shelves of preserves, the clock. He looked at her. "Until you did." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and they sat in the kitchen of the home they had made together inside the mercantile her father had built on the soil of Cutter's Creek, Wyoming territory, with the mountains visible through the window if you stood at the right angle, and the sound of their small son narrating a structural failure of his block tower with great philosophical interest, and the warmth of a fire that they kept burning together. It was not a perfect life. It never would be. There were hard seasons ahead, and there were complicated things that did not fully resolve, and there were losses to come that they could not yet see and would have to face when they arrived. But the thing between Silas and Lillian McCrae was not built on the assumption of perfection. It was built on the harder and more durable foundation of two people who had found each other out of loneliness and stayed with each other out of genuine and specific love, and who had made something real and permanent in a landscape where permanence was always earned at cost. The mountains stood at the end of the street, as they had always stood. The store was open, as it always was. And Silas McCrae, who had ridden the long roads between Texas and the mountains for 2 years looking for the thing that would make him stop, had stopped. He was home.